Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks so much, Cheryl. Good evening. Welcome to our program, the Peacock Room in Detroit, 1904 to 1919. As Cheryl mentioned, my name is William Colburn, and I'm the director of the Historic Freer House, which is part of the Merrill Palmer Skillman Institute at Wayne State University. And I'm greeting you from the space in the Freer House that was built originally for the Peacock Room during its short but important period in Detroit in the early 20th century. In addition to our mission at the Freer House to encourage and support Wayne State University in the preservation and restoration of this important landmark building, another one of our key goals is to raise awareness of the Freer House and its central role in the development of Freer's collection of Asian and American art, and the role that Detroit played in the establishment of the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. as the first art museum of the Smithsonian and the first art museum on the National Mall. So we are always thrilled when a distinguished curator from the Freer Gallery, known today as the National Museum of Asian Art, is willing to prepare a talk for us about the significant Detroit legacy of the museum's art collection in Detroit, and as Dr. Diana Greenwald will graciously be doing for us this evening. As Cheryl mentioned, there will be a Q&A following Dr. Greenwald's lecture, so feel free to put your comments or questions into the chat. But before we move to Diana's lecture, I wish to thank our sponsors for the Freer House Lecture Series, including the Merrill Palmer Skillman Institute of Wayne State University, of course, the Kresge Foundation, the Herb Family Foundation, and the Peacock Room, women's apparel and accessory shops in the Park Shelton and the Fisher buildings. I especially wish to thank the associates of the American Wing of the Detroit Institute of Arts for being our special co-hosts for tonight's program, and invite our Freer House board member and key supporter, Dr. Ken Myers, Curator of American Art at the DIA, to offer a brief welcome now on the DIA's behalf. Ken?
Ken, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ken Myers. I'm Curator of American Art at the DIA, and in that position, I act as staff liaison to the Associates of the American Wing, which was thrilled to be invited to co-sponsor tonight's talk by Diana. On a personal aside, I think I met Diana when she was in Maine, but neither of us are quite sure. That was a long time ago. But I'm proud to say that I was the curator of American art at the Freer from 1999 until 2005, when I joined the DIA. And the Associates of the American Wing will be taking a trip to Washington in April, when Diana is going to give us a great tour of the building. I want to encourage everyone who's listening, who's not a member of the Freer House, to join. And I want to encourage everyone who's listening who's not a member of the DIA or of the Associates of the American Wing to join that wonderful organization. And having said that, I'm happy to turn the evening back to William, I think, to introduce Diana.
Great, thanks so much, Ken, and thanks also to the Associates of the American Wing for joining us tonight. And now some background on our guest speaker. Dr. Diana Greenwald is the Lunder Curator of American Art at the Freer Gallery of Art, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. Dr. Greenwald specializes in late 19th and early 20th century American fine and decorative arts. She's especially interested in the stories of transnational exchange and the ways objects carry and transform culture. Diana has served in various curatorial positions, most recently as Curator of American Art at the Portland Museum of Art in Maine. And she recently joined the Freer Gallery of Art as Curator in 2021. Her recent exhibitions include Mythmakers, The Art of Winslow Homer and Frederick Remington at the Portland Museum of Art. And she also led the reinterpretation of the Winslow Homer studio building for the Portland Museum of Art. Dr. Greenwald received her PhD in the history of art from the University of California, Berkeley, where her dissertation focused on immigrant craft workshops in New York and Boston settlement houses. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diana Greenwald.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. And join in thanking William so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here with supporters of the Freer House, as well as with Ken and his supporters over at the Detroit Institute of Arts. I'm aware that I fill big shoes in following in Ken's footsteps, as well as many others, many of my predecessors who likely you have heard of and heard from in this august forum. So thank you so much again for having me.
Excuse me, Diana, your icons at the bottom. There we go. Thank you.
Better? Great. Okay. So what I'd like to do this evening is to provide an overview of one of the most well-known and bombastic spaces in 19th century art history. This is, of course, the Peacock Room. I certainly hope that many of you have been to the Freer or will be joining us at the Freer to visit this space in person. As many of you, I'm sure, already know, it's a space that one really has to be within to fully understand and to appreciate in its entirety. I'll show as many beautiful images as I can in the meantime, but hope that they serve as enticement for you to join us in person. It's a space that is layered in so many ways with so many fascinating stories, some of which I hope to unravel this evening, but it's a means to discuss relationships between artists and their patrons. It's a way to talk about cultures that come into conversation and into conflict with one another. It's a way to think about questions of collecting and exhibition across culture. And it's a means of understanding the nature of private and public spaces and the public's capacity to appreciate art as it moves across those types of spaces. So what I'm going to do over the course of this evening is to really kind of walk us through the three lives of this space. I'm going to linger, of course, on the history of this space in Detroit as part of Charles Lang Freer's Ferry Avenue home, a space, of course, where our institutions intersect most closely, as well as the subject of the current installation in the Peacock Room in the Freer Galleries, which is called The Peacock Room Comes to America. As William reminded me early in our conversations, we can in some ways really think of the Peacock Room in Detroit as Freer's kind of first attempt at generating and testing out ideas for what would become the National Museum. And to understand this space as such a generative staging area, I think provides us some really wonderful opportunities that we'll be able to delve into this evening. So for those of you who don't know the longue durée of this space and its history, I want to start us not in Detroit in the early 20th century, but rather to begin our story in London. And with Whistler's major patron, here shown on the right, Frederick Leyland. Frederick Leyland was a shipping magnate who purchased a home in London at 49 Prince's Gate, and was someone who, relatively new to wealth, was really interested in populating his spaces to the most up-to-date taste of that moment. He was a patron of the arts, someone who gathered artists around him, the artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. But Leyland was also a major patron of the expatriate painter James McNeill Whistler. Whistler, of course, born in the United States, but really spent the majority of his career in Europe and was living and working in London and working very closely with Leyland to create things like this portrait that you see here on the right, and also to begin to help Leyland decorate the home at Prince's Gate. So you see here some examples of the interiors of that home. Leyland, like good Victorians of his moment, he was very much invested in a sort of eclectic approach to the interiors of his space, and he engaged the services of Thomas Jekyll, who is both an architect and someone who was advising Leyland on the interiors of his space. Leyland begins to engage Whistler to do some small work in his home in the 1870s. So this grand staircase that you see over here on the right, he begins by asking Whistler to create some panels that move up that staircase. You can see them in the center left of this image. And then also Whistler begins to take a larger and larger role in the decorative program of the mansion as Jekyll becomes ill and Whistler is asked to take on a larger role. So Leyland is not only a collector of contemporary British art of his moment. Like many sophisticates of his time, he is also a devotee of Chinese blue and white porcelains. He shares this passion with many collectors of his moment who are bringing in these materials largely through dealers in European capitals rather than going to China in person. He shares this passion, in fact, with James McNeill Whistler himself. So you see here examples of Whistler's own collection of Chinese blue and white porcelain here on the left. And Leyland, like many men of his day, is part of a long tradition of a desire not only to gather these objects from China and from places across Asia, but also to exhibit them in so-called China cabinets and to display and celebrate the patterning and the surface decoration that they're seeing and absorbing and refracting then in many of their interiors. So you see here on the right, perhaps one of the greatest fluorescences of that, the Brighton Palace and some of the Chinese collections that the royals were exhibiting a little bit earlier in the 19th century. But Leyland's very much taking his cues and Whistler as well interested in the importation of these porcelains and their display. Whistler, in addition to collecting porcelain, like many collectors of his moment, is gathering objects in his space from across Asia. So here you see a couple of instances from a suite of paintings that Whistler creates in the 1860s, where you get a sense of that amassing of objects from across Asia that Whistler is engaged in. So we see the blue and white porcelains in Caprice in purple and gold here on the bottom left, or in Princess from the Land of Porcelain here in the center right of that image. But you also get the sense that Whistler is gathering objects such as Chinese furniture, Japanese screens, Japanese fans, kimono, and arraying his spaces, specifically his studio, with these objects and visualizing them by means of pulling them all together with often European sitters at the center of these compositions. So keep Princess from the Land of Porcelain certainly in mind, because she shows up in the dining room that is ultimately created for Frederick Leyland. So here on the left, you see an image of Leyland's dining room in 1892 with Whistler's Princess from the Land of Porcelain presiding over the space. And you see some of the shelving that Thomas Jekyll had originally pulled together for Leyland to display these Chinese blue and white porcelains. What you are also seeing, of course, is one of the kind of greatest artistic flourishes of the 19th century, and what leads to one of the most dramatic artistic feuds of the 19th century, which is, of course, the decorative program that Whistler elects to create across all registers of this space. So many of you may be familiar with the story, but Frederick Leyland allows Whistler to make some small alterations to the dining room and leaves to head to Liverpool, where he has business interests. Whistler, in a flurry of artistic creativity, really lets his imagination run wild across every visible surface of the space. What begins as an effort to have aspects of the space harmonize more holistically with his painting, The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, really explodes in these wonderful and bombastic flourishes, again, across every visible surface. So I'm showing you some key details over here on the left, but again, this is a space you have to be in to truly believe. But you'll see here those Tudor style ceilings that have those wonderful spaces in between where Whistler has inserted the motif of an eye of the peacock. You see this beautiful wainscoting where Whistler has added a background of green and of blue with painted gold flourishes to evoke flowers. You see as well that Whistler takes it upon himself to gild the entire set of cabinetry that Jekyll had installed in order to really make this room glimmer and shine. One of my favorite aspects, and difficult certainly to pick just one, but you see here the center panel of 3 sets of shutters that Whistler decorates to the nines, so that when these shutters are closed, you see these wonderful patterns of peacock feathers that cascade in this wonderful sinuous Aubrey Beardsley almost-esque composition. So throughout the room, Whistler is taking cues from some of the patterns and designs that he's seeing in the Chinese porcelains. But of course, he's also gathering liberally from across his eclectic collection of Asian objects and patterns to just really create this holistic interior that is, as so many Victorians of his moment, this cutting and pasting and pastiche of various types and forms that are coming together to evoke the cultures of Asia that are so enthralling to Whistler, to Leyland, and to so many of his moment. Many of you also know, too, the notorious feud that ensues when Leyland comes back to the room and finds what Whistler has done to his very expensive Spanish leather wall hangings, and indeed also the fee that Whistler is hoping to collect for the work that the uncommissioned work that he has done. So as a final salvo, before he is excommunicated from the room and the family forever, Whistler...
You want to see this on Zoom? This is for that.
Oh, I think maybe we should make sure everybody's muted. So anyway, as a final flourish, Whistler leaves Leyland with this wonderful mural called Art and Money, or the Story of the Room. So what you see here is Whistler, who is never one for subtlety, providing a dramatization of what has passed between he and Leyland. So you see a characterization of Leyland here on the right, who is the offending peacock who is moving into the space of this retreating peacock here on the left. We know this to be Leyland because he has a signature sort of frilly neck piece that was something that Leyland loved to wear. If you remember his portrait, he's wearing this sort of ornate white neck piece. In Whistler's estimation also, Leyland, who is the hoarder of coins, has a body and his peacock feathers that are made, in fact, of coins. When you come to visit us, you'll see too that there's in fact a fake jewel inserted for the eye of this affronting peacock. And Whistler visualized on the left as the retreating bird. And we know this to be Whistler because those of you who can picture images of Whistler, he had a famous shock of white hair, and he's visualized this peacock with that white shock of hair. So it becomes this kind of wonderful means by which Whistler is able to provide a final commentary on this deteriorating relationship. What's interesting about this is, though this quarrel really breaks the connection between patron and artist permanently, Leyland does not dismantle the Peacock Room. He certainly, to some extent, understands that what he has on his hands is one of the greatest masterpieces that Whistler produces. So the room really stays intact through Leyland's passing and on to the next owner, Blanche Watney, who purchases the home after Leyland's death. And we'll sort of put a bit of a pause on the Peacock Room. I'll leave you in suspense a bit about that. And as we turn to the kind of next big player in our story, someone familiar, of course, to very many of you, Charles Lang Freer. And I probably don't need to rehearse this biography, but I will just say very briefly that he is born in New York, and it's in New York that he meets his business partner, Frank Hecker. These two end up joining forces to get into the railroad and the railroad car business. Freer and Hecker end up in Detroit in the very late 1870s. And through a series of successful consolidations, Freer is able to build up a company with Hecker and sell his shares to retire in 1900 at the ripe age of 47, something to which I aspire, though I think probably not in my line of work. And Whistler at this point, and even before that, is someone who's beginning to get interested in the world of art. And the entryway for Whistler is actually through print work. It's something that he begins to collect and get interested in the 1880s. And in 1890, he goes to London and he meets the famed artist and the consummate printmaker, James McNeill Whistler. As we have heard, and in fact, Leyland is not the only one that Whistler feuds with. He is a famously pugnacious artist who makes as many enemies as friends. Interestingly, he and Freer develop a quite collegial and close relationship that lasts over the course of the completion of Whistler's career. So the two men meet and they really develop this nice relationship. And the relationship kind of comes together initially through print work. So they develop a system wherein essentially Freer will get one print out of every subsequent group of objects that Whistler creates. And I think in Freer, Whistler sees an opportunity to find a home in the United States for his work. And in fact, what he calls the opportunity to create, quote, the collection of his work. So Whistler will facilitate Freer's purchase of these works directly from the artist. And Freer in turn will establish this haven for Whistler in the United States. Importantly too, it's also Whistler who encourages Freer to go to Asia and to begin collecting works from across Asia. Whistler, as we know, is not someone who himself went and visited in person, but it is something that he asks Freer to do and something that sparks this collection that will eventually become the Freer Gallery of Art. But I think it's important, and it's something that I'll touch on a little bit more throughout the lecture. It really is the lens of Whistler through which Freer sees the fluorescence of art, through which he understands objects from across the world. It's Whistler who is his kind of touchstone throughout all of this. And so completely fitting that in many ways, the Peacock Room then becomes the fulcrum point of the way that he elects to show his collection and subsequently the museum. So what I'm showing you here on the left is actually the first painting that Freer purchases of Whistler's. Not surprisingly, it is part of that suite of works that Whistler's thinking about objects from Asia. So white women who are in London, but who are adorned in Japanese textiles and holding Japanese fans and instruments. So this kind of conglomeration of European and Japanese themes coming together in an image that is the first to entice Freer into collecting Whistler's paintings. And Whistler also comes into Freer's life by way of The Princess from the Land of Porcelain. So really right after Whistler's death, Freer purchases The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, and it enters his collection. We do know too that Freer is aware of the Peacock Room before he purchases it. He visits it in 1902. And he's actually in the beginning, he's rather hesitant about it. He understands on some level that what he's seeing when he comes to visit that room at 49 Prince's Gate is an important object and an important artwork. But he thinks the whole thing is actually a little too much. So what he wants to do originally is to purchase just the window treatments and not to purchase the entire thing. He gets really the hard sell from Obach, and from the gallerists who have purchased the room and who are trying to offload it hard onto an American patron. So for instance, he is told during negotiations that if you were now to add this masterpiece to your collection, the preeminence of that collection would be beyond all possibility of dispute. So by the time there's a big long back and forth, but eventually Freer does decide to purchase the entire thing. Again, I think initially less because he is entranced by the space in its entirety, but more because he understands it to be part and parcel of a fullest picture of Whistler. And he does understand his role really as a recorder of that full and complete of. So it comes to the United States in 27 crates, and it is bound for Detroit. So to some familiar images likely for you. So the space that that the Peacock Room will come to occupy is a purpose-built space behind the home of Charles Lang Freer. So many of you, of course, know this building very well. An architect by the name of Wilson Eyre of Philadelphia is the one to help Freer design it. It's in close collaboration, of course, with his client that this building comes together. We see a sketch of it over here on the left, and then a 1906 photograph here, on the right. It's an interesting building, of course, as many of you know, because unlike a lot of the homes of folks who are nearby, say Hecker, who are building themselves these really grandiose castle-like structures, Freer elects to build a home in the stick and shingle style. He's someone for whom interiority, privacy matters a lot. So you see here a space that really doesn't feel from the exterior gaudy or overwrought. You see here a space where nature and structure have a great deal of harmony together. For instance, the electing to use stone on the bottom register of the exterior to really connect the space itself to the land from which it's seeming to have emerged really organically. Freer is someone for whom a lot of the connection to nature happens through a lot of these semi-enclosed spaces. So these open porticos and arenas to have that connection between indoor and outdoor. And it's a space for Freer who, as a kind of single gentleman, he's developing a space that he wants to feel comfortable. He's someone for whom the details matter greatly. So both on the exterior as well as the interior of his home. I'm showing you here a contemporary view of the house that you all know so well to just give you a sense of how the exterior really has retained so much of that natural affiliation with the landscape that's surrounding it. Again, many of you are familiar with this, but Freer develops, in addition to close relationships with Whistler, also close relationships with a small suite of American artists who are commissioned to create purpose-created paintings for the interior of his home. So we see artists like Dwight Tryon and Thomas Wilmer Dewing, as well as Abbott, Henderson Thayer, come into Freer's orbit over prolonged periods of time to create suites of paintings that will adorn the interior of his home. And you're seeing a couple of the fruits of that effort over here on the left, Dwight Tryon's Winter, as well as Dewing's After Sunset. We know too that these men were really instrumental in organizing the spaces that would house and enclose the works of art. So they were giving Freer a lot of advice along with Eyre on what the type of wall treatment would look like behind them. They're interested in sheen and opalescence that will really dovetail with the nature of these aesthetic era paintings, that etherealness that glisten to a lot of them. We know that Maria Oakey Dewing, Thomas Dewing's wife, is also someone who's invested in the interior spaces as an expert in interior design, a published author on that topic. Here you see a work that did not ultimately end up in Freer's collection, but that he owned at one time, of Maria Dewings. We know too that the Dewings are also consultants on the exterior spaces and the garden program that are really vital to the nature of the space and understanding how Freer kind of lives in and around the natural world. So what you see here is it's a proposed expansion. So as I mentioned, Freer begins the construction of his home really as that horizontally focused domestic space. But as his collecting increases, as his trips to Asia increase, certainly with the purchase of the Peacock Room, there comes an understanding that the space, which has been very much individualized to him, meant as a haven, as a shelter that felt kind of very, very personal, and with works that were meant specifically for that space. The idea really changes for Freer. And I think what's interesting and important to know is this is also a moment kind of really beginning around 1904 and officially culminating in 1906, that Freer's understanding his collecting, both in terms of his individual proclivities and developing his own theories about what beauty can look like and how we can understand beauty across cultures. But by 1906, Freer has officially signed paperwork for the founding of the first art museum on the National Mall. So it's a moment where that impetus for collecting turns for him markedly, and it becomes both about what he individually likes, cares about, wants to live with, but also about what is going to then be bequeathed to the nation. And that's something that Freer takes very seriously. And for the remainder of his life, he's constantly adding, subtracting to his collections in order to develop and shape a collection that he thinks will have the most impact on the folks that he imagines to be this wider national public. So it's at that time that the Peacock Room comes into the picture. It's also at that time that Freer develops some purpose-built exhibition space. And that tension, I think, between public-private space is one that's so interesting in this Detroit moment, because we are seeing someone who has again, very specific ideas about what he loves, that's traveling all over the world to bring objects into his Detroit home, and is understanding his own personal love of these objects. He's a passionate collector. We know this from the way he writes about the works that come in. But he's also, again, someone who's, as William reminds us, is making a kind of rehearsal for what this is going to look like on a national scale and to a much wider public. And again, always through the lens of Whistler. So you're seeing here a 1906 image of that gallery that's installed entirely with works by Whistler from Freer's collections. I'm showing you here some more contemporary shots, and thank you to the team at the Freer House for providing these, of what the addition that will house the Peacock Room looks like from the outside, as well as what you would see if you were looking out the window into the courtyard from that Peacock Room addition that Freer creates in order to house this work of art. Just to give you a sense again, too, I think of that really kind of beautiful connection between interior world, exterior world, that really does filter through even beyond that initial conceptualization of that private home. So I put this juxtaposition to you to give you a sense of the kind of really drastically, profoundly different way of going about populating the Peacock Room that Freer initiates. So if we remember for Leyland, this armature was all about showcasing his blue and white porcelains. And you see here an installation where we've replicated that effect. So you see the detail in blue glaze that is across the surfaces of these very ornate objects. Freer is not someone who loves blue and white porcelain. And this is in fact a deeply unpopular move on his part. That craze for blue and white porcelain that was so prevalent in Europe extends to the United States. But when Freer goes abroad and when Freer begins to collect in earnest his collection of Asian ceramics, it's not the blue and white from the Kanchi period and that he's really excited about. For Freer, it becomes really all about those iridescent, lustrous surfaces. So what you see here on the left is an installation of works that Freer has collected from China, but I'll give you a sense too of the breadth of collecting that Freer initiates in that ceramics collection. So what Freer's looking at, instead of those very pristine and those white surfaces that feel almost transparent, Freer is looking at surfaces that looked weathered, that are often matte. He's looking at surfaces that aren't ornately decorated, but where the subtle gradations of glaze are evident and visualized. So you see that, say, in the Celadon, Korean Celadon work that's over here on the far right, the depth of that color, the means by which it kind of modulates between green and brown. That's something that really excites Freer. The iridescence of the rockaware that is coming out of Syria in the late 19th century, these newly excavated objects that through chemical interactions with the soil are emerging with this iridescence on their surfaces. Something else that's really exciting to Freer that you see here in the center. Over here on the left is the first Asian ceramic that Freer ever purchases, a Japanese Satsuma ware object that he specifically relates to a Whistlerian landscape. You can see the comparison that I'm making here that is explicit in Freer's conversations around this. So again, that idea of Whistler as really framing all aspects of Freer's collecting. And the way he elects to put these objects into this space is also unique and really wonderful. So what you're seeing here are some installation images from the way you'll see the room when you come visit us in the Peacock Room Comes to America. But you see that there are instances where he's putting like objects from similar periods together. So some of that Syrian rockaware over here on the right. But you're also seeing ways in which Freer is electing to put these objects almost in a painterly way across the surface of this already such richly decorated surface. But over here on the left, you'll see that Christina Spartale, who's the figure who's pictured in The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, has this famously dark hair against light skin. And in this instance, Freer has elected to ring her directly next to that picture with some of the deepest, darkest blacks in the glaze work of the collection that he has. So he's echoing some of the aspects of Whistler's painting in the way in which he's electing to have these groupings amassed across the surface of this room. So it's this really lovely kind of painterly approach. It's an approach that transcends the effort to really categorize very resolutely across these. So we get these wonderful instances where you're able to look across cultures and you're able to make those comparisons, which is really what's so exciting to Freer as he installs these objects in this space. I'll say too that this is a constantly changing and evolving space for Freer. It really is a laboratory wherein he makes these connections, and as his collection grows, he's making alterations and changes. And we know too that he installs this rather incongruous Renaissance era enormous table in the center of the space. But that becomes a surface upon which he can bring objects out for study and for contemplation. So you'll see the image from 1908 here on the left of George Swain's, and over here on the right, one of our wonderful objects, the Alhambra vase that's pictured in the corner, as well as this ritual vessel that you see here on the table. I think this gives you a sense that for Freer, it is a decorative space. It's a space to really play with color across forms, but it's also a space where he can invite in professors, he can invite dealers, he can really bring together people who are excited and interested in the types of confluences that he's able to elicit with these works. And he's doing that in this kind of wonderful space that is all framed around the armature of Whistler. We know too, for instance, that he brings someone who becomes a friend and kind of fellow ceramic enthusiast. And this is someone maybe familiar to many of you as well, probably through the writings of Thomas Brunk, who did a wonderful recent book on Perry and the history of Pewabic. But Mary Chase Perry Stratton is a ceramicist who befriends Freer and who becomes really indebted to Freer thanks to this Rocca, where she's able to begin to explore the potential for iridescent glazes. So those of you who are Detroit natives, of course, know that Pewabic, still in business, very famous for these wonderful lustrous surfaces. And it's through Freer and through close observation and tactile engagement with those objects in a space like the Peacock Room that Mary Chase Perry is able to really study those forms and to then get excited about the potential of working with her own kiln with Horace Calkins to elicit some of those exterior surface qualities on her own works. Freer himself is, of course, really taken with this. They have this really wonderful kind of challenge back and forth where Freer says, I wonder if you can create this, and she can come back with it. And then sort of as a tribute to that, kind of amazingly, these works of art then become the only American ceramics to enter the national collection. So Freer buys these over the course of Stratton's career as she continues to innovate. And we have this group of 30 some odd objects that enable us now as kind of a century on to make those wonderful comparisons as Freer wanted us to across time and across cultures. So you see here, again, an example of the way in which that conversation is happening as Freer hoped between those Rocca ceramics that are coming out of the earth in the 19th century and that engagement that Mary Chase Perry has with them. So I'll take us now just sort of briefly to our last chapter of the Peacock Room. When this space goes from that kind of interstitial space between public and private, where Freer is letting sort of select members in, and in fact also actually letting upon request members of the public into that space. We have actually a Bedecker 1909 advertisement of visiting this space potentially. Oh, let's make sure everybody maybe to keep your self muted. But the last kind of home for this space is really when it comes to the Freer Gallery of Art. So as I mentioned, by the really early part of the 20th century, and certainly by the signing of the papers in 1906, Freer is understanding the materials that he's collecting, his consummate collection of James McNeill Whistler, but also his unparalleled collection of objects, and many of which are ceramics from across Asia, as having a home not merely in his own domestic space, but in a much larger national context. He engages Charles Platt, an architect who, again, is thinking about that connection between nature and the observation of art in creating what becomes this Beaux-Arts structure that becomes the Freer Gallery of Art. So you see a circa 1915 plan for this over here on the left. Freer actually does a tour of institutions, art institutions, and is summarily unimpressed by most of what he's seeing England, but he really likes the idea of a space that is centered around a natural environment. So when you come visit us, you will see, and hopefully our renovation of our courtyard will be complete by then. You'll see that our galleries are really arrayed around the central courtyard so that you have that entrance and access and that moment of respite as you move in and out of the galleries. But at a fulcrum point, as it certainly was for Freer in his conceptualization of the collection and his knowledge of art and his lens of art, the Peacock Room really is an anchor point, as it was in his house in our institution. So this space was conceptualized as always having the Peacock Room present. And the Peacock Room has been on display with us from our opening in 1923 to today. For most of its life with us, the Peacock Room existed largely uninstalled with ceramics. Of course, the decorative patterning across the surface is in itself a monumental work of art. So it is encompassing in and of itself. But what I found interesting also is the discovery of this image circa 1940 that you see here on the right, where the institution actually elected to put a monumental vase from the Peacock pottery to install it in that space, in really the kind of central space of honor. So this is the wall where you're looking kind of directly under, as you can see, that major mural that details that relationship. So this pot that you see on the left from our collection becomes a central point in the space in the 1940s. And it really is that that very visible residue of those conversations across cultures, of that moment when Freer's collection in Detroit sparked a creative output from an arts and crafts workshop that is rooted in Detroit as well. So that notion of that creative practice happening in Detroit and then moving to the spaces even during its last instantiation with us is present. And I'm happy to say that we, in our latest installation of Freer's ceramics, what we call the Peacock Room Comes to America, we've actually installed that very pot in that space of honor. So we ourselves are able to have those conversations as visitors enter that space and enjoy this amazing and encompassing envelope by Whistler with marquee paintings by Whistler, but as a way to frame these beautiful objects from around the world. So I will, I think, close just by, again, hoping that you come to see us in Washington and enjoy the Peacock Room in its instantiation that really evokes the moment in Detroit. And I'm excited to take questions. I certainly, whatever I can't answer, I have no doubt that between Ken and William, we will be able to. So I look forward to a conversation. And again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Greenwald. That was excellent. The dimensions and the specificity of the story between Leyland and Whistler, I just learned so much. So, and I'm sure many other people are going to say the same thing in the chat room. So please put your questions into the chat box and I will read them to Dr. Greenwald as soon as I see them. Thank you so much. I think it takes people a minute to get their thoughts together and decide exactly what they want to ask. No need to be shy. I have from Minna Schwartz, Syme, a question about lighting. Always electric lights in ceiling lights. Are the window shutters always open for natural light? I know you have a fantastic answer for this one.
Yeah, it's a great question. So gas lighting originally, and then a switch to electric light. But as to the natural light question, we'd suspended this for the pandemic, but we have just started the third Thursday of every month. And hopefully you're all marking your calendars assiduously right now, but the third Thursday of every month at noon and throughout the rest of the day, we open the shutters in the room. So you get an opportunity to see that space, not only with electric light, but you do get to see it in natural light, which is how Freer preferred to be in that space and to see the objects in that space. And for anyone who's seen that change, it is transformational. I also like that suite of Rocca ceramics that I showed a couple of times is directly across from those windows. And when the light hits those objects, it is as if they are entirely new objects. So it's actually like a kind of a surprisingly small space, and it opens up that space in amazing ways. It allows you to understand what that really proximate connection with the natural world would have been. And it does really, it changes the ceramics fundamentally to have those windows open. So it's a real treat if you all are able to join us for that.
I think I'm going to jump in and share a story, and I haven't done this with Diana before, but the house that the Peacock room is in at one end of the block has been broken up into separate apartments, but the mirror image house at the other end of the block is still intact. And when you're in that space, you realize that the shutters let you out into a sort of patio, which is built over the kitchen and has stairs down to the inside of a large private park. So that the family, when they were living in the house, would have had the shutters open all the time, because the family wouldn't have wanted to go out onto the street and bring their key to the private park and enter the park that way. They would have been going in and out through the shutters. And of course, the central panel of the shutters, the peacocks that Diana showed us before, they're silhouetted against a moon. So I too imagine that the family would have this great theatrical moment where the shutters have been open all day, the sun is setting, they're inviting people over for dinner, and they shut the room, and all of a sudden you've shut out the light and you're living in the middle of a nocturne. I mean, the room itself functions as the 3D equivalent of one of Whistler's painted nocturnes.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you, Dr. Myers. I have another question from Terry Shea. Can you talk about the process of actually moving the room?
So it's remarkable, I think, that it has had two moves. It came in 27 boxes from London. So essentially the way the room was kind of a little bit, it was on an armature in London, which is how the Blanche Watney figured out that it was in fact saleable as a whole object. So it was sort of slightly apart from the kind of architecture of the room itself. So I should know more, I think, about how each piece, and it's interesting because, I mean, Ken knows this, but there are a ton of different materials that we're dealing with the Peacock room. So you have several pieces that are wood, like the wainscoting and the window shutters, but then you're also dealing with canvas. You're also dealing with these antique leather wall coverings. So each one of those has to be deinstalled, packed, and sent. So that happens with the dealer kind of personally shuttling them from London to Detroit. I believe it's 48 boxes that the room then comes from Detroit to Washington with. But no small feat, certainly. And maybe something I should talk about with our registrars and the folks who do our packing to get a sense of exactly what that would entail. But a lot of work.
Thank you. I think you did cover this a bit in your talk. Did Freer visit the Leyland House to see the Peacock room?
Yeah, he went in 1902, and he was not a fan.
Did Obach and Company purchase the room from the owner after Leyland, or did they just market it?
So they both. So they purchased it, and then we're working extremely hard to get it off their hands as quickly as possible. It's a really funny kind of group of correspondence, because Blanche Watney is also a consummate prevaricator. So it's on the market, then it's off the market, then it's on the market. So Obach is going back and forth with Freer, who they really want to be the purchaser of this, saying, we think we have this for you. No, we don't. No, maybe we have it. No, we don't. And then finally it comes, and there's tons of speculation too. This is a very well-known space. So there's a newspaper article that mistakenly suggests that JP Morgan is the one to have purchased it. There's all this rumor swirling, and Freer's actually trying to keep it quiet that he is the one who's purchased it. But
Diana, because my memories are a little bit vague, but isn't it the case that Watney had already sold Freer the Princess from the Land of Porcelain, so that one of the reasons, because doesn't he buy it first, and then when
he purchases it first, but not from Watney. So Burrell, I think is who.
Right, it's gone up to Glasgow. That's right, from Burrell. So, by the time Obach gets the room, it's already missing the Princess from Land of Porcelain, and Freer owns that. So there's a reason why they want Freer to end up with the whole thing, to be able to reconstruct it.
Exactly.
Let's see. Did the Spanish leather belong to Catherine of Braganza?
Oh gosh, I have no idea.
That's a very specific question. Yes. Okay.
Me
Anyone
too.
else? Ken? No.
I don't think so. I think there's also some question, and again, I haven't done this material in 15 years, but it seems to me that there's some report that Leland thought it was 16th, thought it was earlier than we may think it is. That he bought it thinking that it was like 16th century. I'm going to forget my centuries, and that it's now not clear that it's that early. It's old, but it may not be that old.
Yeah, like many ceramics in Freer's collection, in fact, things were purchased with the presumption that they were older than they were, which doesn't make them any less beautiful, but maybe leads one to wonder how they were marketed. And
we should say, they were painted and they were rather golden. And when you're in that room, it faces east, so it would be a very sunny room to have breakfast in, and the panels were originally golden in color. So Whistler is taking a room that's designed by Jekyll to be yellow and sunny and golden, and he's turning it into a nocturne. So what he does to Leyland's room is really pretty egregious.
Yeah, it is certainly dramatic. I mean, many years previous to me, we did a rendering of what those ceramics actually would have looked like and what the room would have looked like with the original patterning on that wallpaper, on the Spanish leather wall covering. And it's a lot. It's a lot.
You briefly mentioned a Bedecker in connection to Freer allowing select members of the public into his home. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah, I'm gonna find the quote because it's pretty funny. Hold on 1 minute. So in 1909, in the Bedecker, they say, quote, "The finest private art gallery in Detroit is that of Mr. Charles F. Freer, 33 Ferry Avenue East, for which free cards of admittance may be obtained at 915 Union Trust Building. This gallery contains the largest group of works by Whistler in existence and good examples of Tryon, Dewing, and Abbott Thayer, as well as many Oriental paintings and potteries." So available to those who could obtain their tickets at the Trust Building.
How did you pick the ceramic pieces to display?
Oh, it's a great question. So I showed you, I think, some of the images from 1908 that George Swain took. And this was the genius of my predecessor, Lee Glazer, who she, along with our registrars and our conservation staff, enlarged those images. So professional photography is taken in 1908. Of all four sides of the room. So they enlarged those images. And then because the Freer collection, nothing leaves that collection, we knew we had on our hands every one of those objects. Actually, unless something had changed between 1908, but if Freer had taken something out. In any event, we had these objects. So what the task was then with those photographs to match every single object to objects in our collection. As you can imagine, some of those very easy matches, they're unique objects that had a unique silhouette, so easy to do. Much more difficult with a lot of the kind of smaller Japanese tea bowls, for instance. So this was really yeoman's work, but that is how in 2011, when we did this for the first time, the team was able to assemble this room as close as we could to what it would have looked like in 1908.
Thank you. Having sent his collection to DC, did Freer leave an endowment for the preservation of the house in Detroit?
Oh, I'll leave that to William.
Sorry, you'll have to unmute, William. I can't unmute you.
I can guess his answer.
Yeah.
I think we got the endowment.
Yes, the answer is going to be unfortunately not.
Uh-oh. Oh, it's not unmuted.
I'll answer for William.
Okay.
No, the house was left to the Smithsonian, which sold it, and it was bought by Merrill Palmer. and an endowment did not go with it. And William very much wishes that one did.
Yes, we are all so well aware of that, aren't we?
Oh, you're highlighted.
Oh, sorry, I have a participant who unmutes occasionally. When I visited Freer Gallery, the 1st of October, I saw the Quabic pottery at exactly the center place, down 2 peacocks. I felt honored as a resident in Michigan for more than 30 years. Sorry, that's not a question, that's just a comment.
Well, and I'm rather new to Washington, but there's a group of tiles, Peacock tiles at the Church of the Immaculate Conception at Catholic University that is apparently pretty wonderful. So I'm certainly due to go pay them a visit. So not the only place you can see Peacock in Washington, D.C. when you come visit.
William is now unmuted. Would you like to add anything to that previous question
Well,
about the endowment?
yeah, Ken unfortunately was correct. No, the endowment was not left for the preservation of the house. So therefore we have to depend, like many historic sites in the Detroit area, on the public and on good owners like Wayne State University to properly invest in maintaining what's really a national treasure of this house. So it's an ongoing effort. And I would have to just add, I think the only historic house in Detroit entirely that has a full endowment is the Eleanor Netzel Ford House in Grosse Pointe.
Thank you. Our last question that's up now, are the ceramics rotated, and maybe some details as to how and when?
Sure. So what we've tended to do in the last decade or so, so as you all saw, for many, many years, there really wasn't much of any ceramic display in that space. And then we inaugurated this effort both to have for a number of years what we call the Peacock Room Comes to America, which is that installation of Freer's works. Excuse me. We have a different installation called the Peacock Room in Blue and White. So we don't have Leyland's collection of blue and white ceramics. Those were sold with his estate in the 1890s. But what we do have are objects from the Freer that are of the period of Chinese blue and white porcelain. We didn't have enough to populate every niche in that space. So we actually partnered with a kiln in the same region, and we gave them the dimensions of the niches that we were looking to fill. And so it's partially, when we do that installation called the Peacock Room in Blue and White, it is partially objects that are period objects, and then partially these 20th century recreations, but to give you the sense of what that space would have looked like and felt like were you to walk into Leyland's dining room.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn the program over to William Colburn now.
Diana, this was an extraordinarily beautiful, engaging, and enlightening presentation, and you really brought all these many threads together. And of course, it always seems like we're just skimming the surface and could always use more time with the Peacock Room. But thank you for especially bringing forward the Detroit period. And I just really want to acknowledge the institution, the Freer Gallery of Art, National Museum of Asian Art, your predecessors, and of course yourself now, in taking on the Detroit story of the room. Traditionally, as one might expect, the museum would talk about the room and interpret it as it was originally in London. And Detroit never really received attention until about 10 years ago. So it's really thanks to the rediscovery of the Detroit story that part of this important history is being told. And there's many more Detroit stories hopefully to come forward in the future. So thank you for highlighting Freer's legacy and preserving the room and saving it, and here in Detroit, and then ultimately at his museum in Washington. So I'd like to mention that also in terms of our approaching the centennial year of the opening of the Freer Gallery is next year, 2023, for the opening of the gallery in 1923. And we look forward to many more engagements between Detroit and Washington to help tell the story of the transition of the collection from the Freer House to the Freer Gallery 100 years ago. And I especially want to thank right now my colleagues, Cheryl Deep and Ryan Cunningham, for mastering the coordination of this program and for all the hard work they put into making sure it went as smoothly as possible. And also many thanks to our sponsors that were mentioned earlier, to our Freer House members and supporters. and also to all of you who've attended from around Detroit and across the nation for this evening. A recording of tonight's lecture will be available and sent to everybody who registered. It will also be available soon on our website where it can be accessed and shared. And we encourage you to watch for our next program in the Fuhrer House Lecture Series, which will take place in February of next year. And I wish everyone a very good night. Thank you, and thank you, Diana, once again.
Diana, you're getting many positive comments in the chat box. I hope you have a minute to take a look. People are very, very happy with the presentation.
I'm so glad. It was fun to put together.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Diana.
Thank you, Diana.